Okay. Let's get started. I just have to say this is so exciting. After 7 months of planning virtually every day, it's amazing to see all of you in the room here today. And I just want to say welcome and thank you for coming. You know, this discussion really requires a group of thoughtful and diverse people. And as organizers, we're excited that we have the dream team with us for 24 hours. And I also want to thank HHMI is so amazing. Christabel Salmon, the meeting organizer here at HHMI, has done amazing things to make this happen. And also Mike Haley, you'll see over the next day, has done incredible work for IT support and getting this meeting distributed to anyone that wants to listen through the internet. So I think during the course of the next day, we will have some differences in opinions. But I do want to start with sharing some views that I think all of us in this room will have in common. So first of all, why did you all come here? There are people who are coming here from China, from Europe, and all of you, well, I have to even mention Michael Hendricks, who could not get his flight here today from Montreal because of the weather, and is taking a train all day and all night just to be here because he feels it's important to be here for this conversation. And all of you are busy, but you felt it was important to be here too. And the reason why we're here, and the reason why people are watching us on the internet now, is that we all are deeply committed to science. That's why we're here. We love our profession, and we believe in the importance of our work. And we represent different parts of the ecosystem, practicing scientists, university chairs and administrators. There are people from representatives from funding agencies, scientific societies, and publishers. But for the next 24 hours, we're not just representing our institutions or our companies, but we're really here as citizens of science, trying to do some important work. And we're here because we're all trying to do something good for the scientific community. So I also like to talk about some of the big picture issues behind this meeting, which again, I think we all share in common. So first of all, I think we all believe in promoting scientific progress and also the responsibility that we have in making the best use of the funds that we receive from taxpayers and foundations. We may differ in our opinions of how to use those funds sometimes, whether it's better to invest in cryo-EMs or next-generation sequencers, what the right ratio of funding is for small labs versus big projects. But I think the one thing that we all can agree on is the tremendous power and multiplying effect of information. And also we can attest to the amazing creativity of the human brain. The fact that tens of thousands or millions of people can look at the same set of information and come up with unique ideas or solutions. So I think we can all agree with the fundamental importance of access to information for the progress of science. Secondly, I think we can all agree on the importance of attracting the very best young people to science and making a scientific career attractive to them. I became an independent investigator when I was 27 years old. And I think we're all troubled by the increasing time that it's taking to advance through the system from a graduate student to a postdoc to become truly independent. And I think we all can probably agree that if there are any sensible steps, even if small, that if we can reverse this trend to some extent, that would be important. Third, I think we all agree on the importance of scientific culture in our personal success and also in the success of our institutions. And the joy of making a scientific discovery is as tremendous as it ever was. Science is exciting, and that's the nature of science. That is what makes it so attractive to young people. But we have to make the communication of that discovery to our scientific colleagues, also a joyous event, particularly for our trainees, and less arduous than it is now. So my own personal journey to this meeting actually and on preprints began with two planning sessions, both here at HHMI. The first in 2012 when I was president of the American Society of Cell Biology, where we talked about the scientific enterprise in more general terms, and also another meeting that was organized by Harold Mark, Shirley Tillman, Bruce Alberts, also on the scientific workforce and other elements of the scientific enterprise. And the conclusion from this is these issues are very complex. They involve many factors. But I was struck at both meetings that the subject of publication came up over and over again, especially with regard to its influence in the three issues that I just talked about: advancing scientific progress, the training of young scientists, and scientific culture and openness of communication. And hence, we all could probably agree that time spent thinking about the issue of publishing is a well worthwhile effort. But publication is a big topic. It encompasses many issues: impact factors, reforming peer review, post-publication review. And I know that many of you here are deeply interested and involved in these issues, and we certainly do not disagree with the importance of those issues. But we also feel that it's best to focus on one topic with sufficient depth that we may hope to understand it, and that we may hope to ascertain if there's a path forward. So the topic of this meeting is preprints. Many biologists don't know much about preprints. I assume and hope that the audience here today has learned about this issue. But also I should say for our internet audience that you will hear about them shortly from Paul Ginsberg. And there is a short educational video on the subject on the ASAPbio website. So as organizers, we also recognize that some of you may here or elsewhere disagree with the focus of this meeting. Some say that preprints actually could take us too far into uncharted waters. Conversely, others say that the meeting does not take us far enough in directions that we need to go. So given these diverse views and concerns from the spectrum of people in the scientific community, let me just be clear on behalf of the organizers what the meeting, first of all, is not about. The meeting is not about forcing scientists to use preprints. That will have to be their choice. It's also not about dismantling the journal system. We are also not here to debate whether preprints should exist or should not exist, because they exist. Rather, we are here for 24 hours to understand preprints and analyze the role that they can play in communicating results in biology. So we as organizers also understand the very significant responsibility in calling this meeting. And even before reaching a decision to hold this meeting, we did our best in researching the issues behind preprints and canvassing opinions from various groups in the community. We also did not choose this topic randomly, but thought it represented a large overlap in the Venn diagram between potential large-scale impact and also near-term feasibility of execution. So we do not know what the outcome of this meeting will be. That's for all of us to decide and work on in the next 24 hours. But we have invested a reasonable amount of time talking to scientists, funders, journals to assess possible support and understand as much as possible the issues surrounding preprints. And one of the great things about this exercise is just working together as organizers. The four of us have had an amazing journey the last 6 months with thousands of emails, weekend phone calls together and the sort, because we feel that it was our responsibility to execute this meeting as well as could be done, because we have a responsibility here for the whole scientific community. And we also realize that changing habits in anything as complex as publishing is going to be difficult. And there will never be universal support. However, our best judgment as organizers is that a meeting on preprints in biology is at least timely, and that clarifying the use of preprints is valuable given the current state of ambiguity, and that concrete actions and possible positive outcomes, while not guaranteed, could emerge. So nothing is simpler than a preprint. It takes the same amount of time to deposit a preprint on a server as it does to book an airplane ticket. But behind this simple act lies many complexities, and we need to dig into this subject as thoroughly as possible during this meeting. The order of topics of this meeting reflects the key issues that affect the viability of preprints in the scientific community, issues that have been worked out in the physics community but not yet in the life sciences. And we need to focus on those first. First of all, do we as scientists actually want a preprint system where we can disclose our work to our colleagues and control the timing of that disclosure? Or do we see it as a predatory situation for getting scooped? Second, do journals want to work with preprints or not? Many scientists want to know the answer to this question because many researchers still want the freedom to choose where to submit their work to a journal and choose the journal of their choice. Third, do funders and academic institutions see value in preprints? Scientists and potentially, for example, would they allow preprints to be cited in grants or promotions, perhaps even promote the use of preprints? Scientists also want to know the answer to this question because it's these parties that govern the reward system and the careers of scientists. And finally, we also have to understand potential unintended consequences, and if there are possibilities, we need to know how to assess them. We also need to know how to manage all the new information that may come with a preprint system. We hope to get an inkling of answers to all these questions during the meeting, but we also appreciate that all these issues are going to take considerable follow-up work and discussion after this meeting. But what we need to know from you right now at this meeting is if you think this effort will be worthwhile. And indeed, all of you can also play key roles in the follow-up discussions, because something as audacious as changing the habits of how scientists work is only going to really happen from discussions between a student and his or her PI, by encouraging discussions amongst young scientists, through instructions to promotion committees at universities all around the world, and in study sections at the NIH and in other countries. So it's going to require also conversations at board meetings of journals and funding agencies that could not be here with us at this meeting. And it's going to take discussions at leadership retreats at various scientific societies. So I also want to say that as much as valuable as this group of 70 people are in this room, I do want to say that the most important stakeholders here are actually, some of which may be watching in the community, but are the thousands of young scientists, the graduate students, the postdocs, the junior faculty who are going to be watching this meeting remotely. And I had nothing to do with this, but I'm very pleased that a group of graduate students at UCSF organized a watch party over pizza to see what's happening at this meeting, and that's probably happening elsewhere. But let's be frank, these are the young people who are actually making the discoveries that are benefiting the community and society. And it's their future careers in science that are less certain than mine or many people in this room. So we need to keep them first and foremost on our minds as the target group that we're trying to assist. And we need to understand their concerns and maintain a reality check of what drives their decisions. For these reasons, working with Daniel and Jessica has been extremely important in planning this meeting. But we do think that there is, again, this interesting intersection in the Venn diagram of preprints between good for the entire community and also good for the individual scientist, including the young scientist. But young scientists should and will ultimately decide whether it makes sense for them to use preprints based upon whether preprints will benefit also their work and careers. And as senior leaders, all we can do is remove some of the current roadblocks and put a sensible system in front of them and then let them make the decisions. So there's no doubt that what we're talking about, preprints, is an experiment in the life sciences. But I also want to stress that we're doing another important experiment of perhaps greater consequence, which is this meeting itself. So many people, first of all, are watching on the internet. And they're watching to see what we do. And they're watching to see how we behave. And I think they are desperately hoping to see some sort of success. So can we, different constituents of the scientific enterprise, come together in a room and work together for the common good? Or are we going to be fragmented and driven by personal interests? Are we going to be whining about problems and casting blame? Or are we going to be focused on realistic solutions and looking for opportunities to work together? Are we going to be listening to one another and finding ways to compromise? Or are we going to be locked into ideas that we carried in with us into this room? Can we work in transparent ways with the community, as we're attempting to do by this live streaming and Twitter, instead of working behind closed doors? Is it even possible for us to make any sort of real progress on an issue where the community currently sees stalemate? I'm an optimist by nature, and I'm also optimistic here. But I appreciate the challenges that are in front of us for this meeting. However, if we succeed in even partial measure, it will send a very positive signal that this type of meeting and this type of interaction could be successful for other topics in publication and other issues facing the biomedical community. So the task in front of us is not to solve everything, but to work together well and potentially take one positive and sufficiently visible step forward. And in that spirit of leadership, it was President's Day yesterday. And there's a beautiful memorial here in Washington, D.C. It's the Thomas Jefferson Memorial. I'm sure many of you have been there. And when you walk into that memorial, you'll see surrounding the statue of Thomas Jefferson 4 quotations. And one of those quotations, I think, is applicable to this meeting. So I'll read you that quotation here. I am certainly not an advocate for frequent and untried changes in laws and constitutions. I think moderate imperfections had better be borne with, because once known, we can accommodate ourselves to them and find practical means of correcting their ill effects. But I also know that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. So thank you, and I would now like to introduce my next fellow co-organizer here, Daniel.
I just realized I didn't include any quotes from Thomas Jefferson in mine, so had a chill go down my spine. So my name is Daniel Colon Ramos. I'm an associate professor at Yale University, and I've had a lab for about 7 years, and I'm a scientist. So as a scientist, my job is to disseminate and to produce knowledge. And I knew that Ron was going to give a broad overview about the conference, and that later Harold and Jessica were both going to give insights and some statistics of the surveys and some information about how people have replied to things. So what I wanted to do in these 10 minutes was to share with you my experiences as a scientist in the last decade And hopefully in that experience, in publishing and in producing knowledge, in disseminating knowledge, there may be some lessons there that resonate that where there's a space for preprints. And I want to start by saying that I'm not representing here junior faculty or all scientists. I'm just representing my own experiences, but hopefully they help illuminate part of the conversation. So when I started as a scientist 7 years ago, it was probably one of the hardest times to start a lab because of the funding climate and the pressures that were happening at the time. Some of them have changed a little bit for the better. There's an awareness now of the funding requirements, but back then it was pretty hard. It's still hard, but it was pretty hard. And one of my first papers, when we were trying to get it out, our first body of knowledge that we're producing, it took us about a year and a half to go through the review process. At a time when we were applying for grants, we were coming up for promotion, so the pressure was high. And I relate these experiences, I don't want to belate this point too much, but I wonder what space preprints would have served. I mean, things worked out for me, but I know for other colleagues of mine it didn't work out as well. And the timing in academia, both in terms of grant evaluations and promotions, is actually very tight and unforgiving, and it doesn't necessarily match the timing of the review process. So I wonder what space, as we have the conversations today, what space these preprints could occupy in helping serve as evidence for junior faculty that are starting their careers, particularly in this type of climate, as evidence of productivity, as sharing of knowledge. But I don't want to belay that point too much, because if you talk to essentially most faculty, particularly faculty that have started in the last decade, they will have similar stories. I mean, this story is not an unusual story, it's not a point outside of the graph. But I wanted to talk about a story that's more particular to my situation, which has to do with dissemination of science. So about 10 years ago, I became interested. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, and I became interested in disseminating science in Puerto Rico. And I'll start by owning the fact that I've been very privileged in the way that I've been able to do science throughout my career. I've worked primarily in Research One institutions in the United States. I've never done research in Puerto Rico. So I was frankly shocked when I learned about the fact that not only, I mean, many of the topics that we're going to be talking about today is going to be about dissemination of knowledge, but dissemination of knowledge mostly framed around the audience here, which is Research One institutions. And the access to knowledge is asymmetric in the world. It's not the problems that we have represent about, it's the problems of the elite. I mean, they represent about 1%, they're the tip of the iceberg in terms of the problems. They're very important, but when I was bringing kids from institutions in the United States that are not Research One institutions to my lab, students that the NIH was paying for to train in my lab, when they went back to their institutions, they were unavailable, they were incapable of accessing my papers. And that made me realize that there was a huge, and this is true for developing countries too, there's a huge asymmetry in terms of how knowledge is distributed. And that was actually, when I was learning about archives, that was one of the inspirations, and I think we'll hear about this when Paul talks, that led to the creation of archives. How is it that we can disseminate knowledge? But it also led me to reflect profoundly about the roles of the way that we are as scientists sharing knowledge and our roles as scientists in the way that we share knowledge and disseminate knowledge with regards to recruiting the best minds around the world. And also when we are frankly upset about scientific illiteracy nationally, like what roles are we playing to keep that illiteracy going when we are not facilitating access to people that want to access that kind of work? And this touches on on other issues that will maybe diffuse the conversation to open access and other things. And I want to refocus it on the topic of preprints, which is the topic that we were discussing here. And I just wanted to bring those topics so that they're in the back of our minds when we're thinking about preprints and what roles mechanisms like preprints could play in facilitating that also very important job that we have as scientists in disseminating knowledge, particularly disseminating knowledge outside of our immediate spheres of influence. So with that, I just wanted to frame it on those two experiences as scientists: production of knowledge and dissemination of knowledge. And hopefully, as the conversations go on, we can also think not only about the people that are here and about the people that are in our Research One institutions or our immediate colleagues, which topics that are very important for advancing science, but also what our roles are in the 21st century broadly as scientific disseminators, and how the structures that we're seeking to create here could help us in that job. Thank you.
Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Harold Varmus, and I'm very glad to see you all here. If I can get my notes up here, I'll be happier. So this is an important event for all of us, and it's important because we live in a holy temple of science, and publication is the lifeblood of that enterprise. All of us know that publication, however it's done, is the way we transmit and receive what's happening in our labs and in the scientific community, and it's essential to our lives as scientists and essential to the world that appreciates the work we do. It's been my view for some years that life scientists in particular, perhaps all scientists in general, have been slow to take full measure of the opportunities afforded by the internet to disseminate our work more efficiently. And today we're focused on one potential use of the internet, a use that has been already validated in other fields, namely the use of posting of unreviewed manuscripts to improve the way in which we do disseminate our work, assuming that underlying concerns about preprints can be addressed and resolved, and hopefully that will happen at this session. Now, Ron has already spoken eloquently to many aspects of the problem we're thinking about, and what I'd like to do in just a couple of minutes, and it will literally be only a couple of minutes, is to draw your attention to the connection between the discussions we'll have over the next couple of days with three much broader issues in the life sciences. The first has to do with an issue that Ron raised briefly, and that is, how do we as scientists who are addressing the problems of biology try to confront the malaise that is widely acknowledged to afflict the way in which we operate? Many of us in this room have been engaged with these problems over the last several years. In fact, all four organizers of this meeting have joined a small committee that's trying to improve various ways in which we work. Others of you in the room, I see Jeremy and others who have been involved, are trying to think through quite a long list of things that can be important in trying to combat this general malaise. We generally acknowledge that biomedical research, the life sciences research, has become hyper-competitive, often oppressively so, and we've created a world in which there is now fierce competition for grants, for jobs, for places in the prestigious journals that one could argue unduly influence the way in which we evaluate ourselves and influence reputations. Now, there are lots of ways in which these changes can be made to improve the atmosphere in which science is currently done in our various fields. And I think you all know about some of those things. They include the way in which we construct and fund our laboratories, the duration, the size, the purpose of grants issued by agencies from the NIH to philanthropies, by changing and further evaluating the criteria we use to judge scientists, whether we think about giving grants for people versus projects, or whether we are worried about basic research or applied research. These are all important issues that play a role in combating the difficulties that biomedical research is facing these days. Universities can have a role in changing the organization of laboratories and thinking about how they recruit and promote people, training programs, the entrance of people into the pipeline, the diversification of graduate experiences, all those play a role as well. But changes to publication practices, especially the institutional and especially the way we think about using preprints, whether we can provide some confirmation of the idea that preprints are acceptable for scientists of distinction to use. All of these things could have major remediating effects on the current climate in research. The second point I'd like to make is that the issue that we're confronting here, as Ron has pointed out, is only one of many issues that we need to be thinking about in the dissemination, or call it publication, process. I think my own view is that this might be simply a first step in a much more radically constructed transformation of the way we disseminate our work, and leading to the development of something that could be much more beneficial in the way we communicate our findings in the future. We understand that changes of a more radical sort require cultural change. Even the adoption of preprints is going to require a cultural change. Things are not going to be transformed overnight. Those of us who have been active in the open access movement know things happen slowly. Journals, societies, people used to the current system shouldn't feel threatened, but I think they need to proceed with their eyes open, recognizing that the kinds of things we're talking about today could lead to much deeper changes than we'll be discussing. I think it is important to recognize that over the last couple of decades, we, throughout the scientific community, including the biomedical community, have made some important changes. We now have formats in all journals that are at least partly adapted to the potential of online publishing. We have created public digital libraries that have large percentages of the products of our research. We have new forms of dissemination, including open access journals and many other ways to provide data sets and aggregates of genomic information to people who can appreciate them. We have a variety of servers for posting manuscripts that constitute preprint servers, and we have online tools for post-publication commentary, and these are all advances. But now we need to think, in my view, as we discuss preprints specifically, about ways in which some of these developments can be integrated. And I would like to see at least some discussion, which we'll have, I believe, tomorrow afternoon, about how we might take what we are currently calling the posting of preprints to a different phase in which it becomes publication itself, followed by post-publication review, visible and moderated, anonymous or not. There are plenty of open questions about exactly how that would work and how those processes could be gradually adopted and disseminated, and how these new methodologies will be evaluated and further validated. But I think we need to be conscious of the fact that in talking about posting preprints, we may not simply be talking about what happens in the physics community, as Paul Ginsberg will describe. The final point I want to come back to is the question of how what we're talking about is consonant with the concept of science as a public good. We're all talking here so far largely about the way in which the institution of preprint servers might be good for institutions and especially for individual scientists. But we need to think, in my view, about the idea of reasserting the roles of scientists as good citizens and as providers of public goods. It may well be that before we can rise to that higher level, we need to change the atmosphere in which science is being done. And we don't want to deny the fact that preprint servers can be good for individual careers. But I think it's also in these conversations to be aware of the fact that science is a higher calling, in my view, and that we are, most of us at least, leading a privileged way of life at public expense, and that it seems to me important as we deliberate about issues that may affect the careers of young people or even more senior people, that we also have a responsibility to try to fulfill our contracts of society, a society that supports many, if not all of us, to do the great work that we have lived lives enjoying doing. Thanks very much.
Hello, I'm Jessica Polka. I'm a postdoc at Harvard Medical School. And I want to share with you today, building off of this idea of looking to the rest of the community for buy-in and engagement on the topic of preprints, the outcomes of our first attempts to do this in terms of getting a survey. Sorry, is the PowerPoint up or? Okay, so we conducted a survey on our website. Thank you. To try to bring the voices of people who are not together with us in this room, in particular junior scientists and others in the research enterprise, into our discussions. So we had almost 400 responses. And as you can see, they represent a variety of groups within the academic research enterprise. Although I'd like to note that graduate students are still underrepresented in this survey. And of course, as you can see here, we are seeing a lot of response from both North America and research-intensive institutions. So we need to take these results with a grain of salt. But one thing that really comes out of the survey is that over 90% of the respondents are not satisfied with the current state of publishing. And I think obviously our survey is going to enrich for people who know about preprints and perhaps have used preprints. And yet, 30% of the respondents say that they have used them. But for those who have used them, they're an extremely positive experience. So this prompts the question, why aren't more people using preprints? One potential idea that we had was, of course, that journal policies might discourage people from doing so. And indeed, 60% of the respondents say that this is a disincentive for them to submit preprints. And so the question becomes, if preprints are a way of accelerating and bringing science to a more democratic audience, how can we encourage their use? What policy changes would be enacted to enable this? And so we asked the survey respondents, should a preprint constitute evidence of priority discovery? Is this a valid way of communicating a scientific result? We asked them, should grant agencies recognize preprints as evidence of productivity? We asked them, would they like a system of commentary built on top of a preprint server? And should a preprint server be indexed on PubMed? And so, as you can see, the majority of survey respondents, which are clearly not representative of the necessarily representative of the enterprise as a whole, are in favor of these progressive attitudes towards preprints. So this kind of points our efforts into certain directions and leads us to ask, would specific interventions or changes in policies or attitudes promote the use of preprints? So we asked respondents, how likely are you to submit a preprint now versus if preprints represented priority of discovery, if they were acceptable to journals and grant agencies. And you can see here that the majority of respondents favor these changes and say that they would be more likely to enhance their probability of submitting a preprint. And so this response really guided our thinking about how to create outputs or how to propose outputs of the meeting that could be feasible, actionable, and practical. And we certainly don't want to restrict the discussions at the meeting, nor do we want to argue that these outputs are in any way necessary. But we propose, and this is replicated on the website as well, a statement for scientists to sign indicating their intended behaviors about the use of preprints, a statement for journal editors and publishers to sign, which could clarify policies, a request to funding agencies to clarify how preprints can be cited, a definition of desirable characteristics of preprint servers, a draft of which is already up in the commentary section. It's great. And the generation of ideas and possible next steps on preprints. And finally, a summary and a meeting report. So I want to highlight the first two because we are putting before you now essentially drafts of these documents, which are prepared, the first by the organizers and the second by representatives of journals, for your comments. And we're hoping to do this so as to, during the span of the meeting, revise them in a productive fashion. So the first draft statement basically states that as responsible citizens of the scientific community, recognizing that preprints are not peer-reviewed, we would like to cite original work presented as preprints and acknowledge some work as appropriate in other ways. And of course, there's other language around this. And importantly also that preprints should be considered on applications and for other promotions. And the second draft statement essentially suggests that preprints do not constitute prior publication or a breach of press embargoes, and so therefore will not prejudice the peer review process. And so before 1:15 p.m. tomorrow, we request that everyone visits the website and goes to the draft section, which is under feedback. So it's also ASAPbio.org drafts. And this includes, by the way, everyone watching, not just those of us in the room. And there's two links here, which you can click, which take you to Google Forms. And this indicates your level of your attitudes about the document in general, but also provides individual fields for you to suggest comments on each paragraph. And again, we ask that those watching on the live stream and others interested in the meeting also submit their feedback too, as we certainly can't make change without buy-in from the whole community, especially where the attitudes and behaviors of scientists are concerned. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, as a meeting organizer, you're always wondering about what could go wrong, and thinking about, okay, what is the worst thing that could go wrong at this meeting? And of course, that would be that our keynote speaker, Paul Ginsburg, would be stuck at the airport and not be able to come here. So, of course, that, the worst nightmare actually came true, and that depressed me for a lot of the day today. Until I realized maybe there's some poetic, justice here, that the man that brought science communication to the internet is also delivering his talk through the internet. So maybe it's just fine, because this is kind of symbolizing actually how far our whole system of communication has come. So I am very sad from a personal point of view that Paul's not here, because I feel like I know him so well by now, and I've had he's been very patient with me and all of us as organizers as we've tried to learn more about preprints through multiple emails with him and phone conversations. And he's just an amazingly thoughtful and innovative individual. And so I'm sorry I can't be here to meet him. But I also would say, when I mentioned that intersection between impact and feasibility, that statement is entirely based upon 25 years of success of arXiv. And what arXiv has achieved in a scientific community, the impact that it's made, especially for the amount of investment per year, I think is probably the best investment that's ever been made in scientific research. So I think really in biology, we really need to look to the physics community, because they've done a 25-year experiment for us. And I think many of the questions that are very mysterious to us are very commonplace in the physics community. In many cases, the results of the experiments that are troubling us have actually already been performed. So I think, Paul, are you there? Are you there, Paul? Oh, there you are. Okay. So anyway, I also just want to state that I hope as we go forward that we actually work more closely with Archive and Paul and Ralph and other people from the Archive community, because we have so much to learn from them in their enormously successful 25-year experiment that Paul will tell us about now. So thanks, Paul. That's your turn. Okay. So can you hear us, Paul, too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, you're on. I'm walking off the stage now.
I've been following with great interest. I apologize, of course, that I am not there. Believe me, it would be much more fun to be there. It's actually quite awkward sitting in front of this little screen in my office and trying to give a good talk. It doesn't. It'll take a while for me to get some sort of rhythm. And while I'm hearing all of these wonderful, high-minded comments, from my point of view, I'm just thinking that 25 years ago I wrote some trivial seashell software, and ever since I've been the poster boy for truth, justice, and the American way, and which of course afforded me the distinct thrill this morning of sitting for 4 hours in the Ithaca airport without success. So let's see if this works. Yeah. So since there's a big audience here, and I was told there was, just a need for a little bit of historical background, I'll provide that. I dug up something that I wrote 17 years ago. Well, I guess a little over 16 years ago, when Harold, who just spoke a bit earlier, had floated his e-biomed proposal. And I just wanted to make the point that some of these things we've seen already. Most of what I'm about to say here, I guess my mouse doesn't work, so I happily color-coded it in green. Most of what I'm going to say here is already in this screen. It describes a talk that I gave at the Banbury Center, Cold Spring Harbor, December 98, where I described what was then, called the ePrint archives and how it improved the dissemination of results in physics and mathematics, had various advantages. They're entirely scientist-driven, flexible enough to coexist with pre-existing publication, evolve something better, made possibly, and looking to the long term, a more functional system for scholarly communication. And this was an interesting meeting. I would say that there was as well a petition passed around by Mike Eisen and Pat Brown, which ultimately became the basis for PLOS. David Lippman was there, and subsequent discussions with him and with Harold, who was not there but was the director of the NIH, ultimately resulted in the creation of PubMed Central, and I served on that advisory board as well as the PLOS advisory board for a while. So there were outcomes of that meeting, but none of them really implemented preprints in the original form. And so in this thing I wrote over 16 years ago, I made this snide comment about how it's thrilling if the biomedical people are ready to join the 1990s, better late than never. And every 2 years or so, I'm asked the same thing, and I consciously just repeat the same phrase. So you can see at the bottom here, I just searched for myself and belatedly joining the late 20th century, and I found about 20 or 30 different appearances. 3 or 4 years ago, article in Nature by Ewan Callaway made that same comment. So this is a good experiment to be doing with me not there. If there really is, if it's not the same old, and the 2-year recycling time, if there actually is real progress coming out of this meeting, then we'll have determined that the best way to do it is without me there. Okay, so this is a screen grab. I'm going to start out with, let me check the time here. I'm going to start out with some standard slides that I use just so that, we can get the general background. And then I have a bunch of slides that I had specifically prepared for this meeting in the airport this morning. That wasn't a joke. Okay. This is a screen grab from about 10 years ago, although it's a little different from what the current system is. And I usually describe this as lectures in both half empty or glass half empty or glass half full terms. The glass half full, of course, is what amazing prescience to have designed a system 20 years ago, which never needed to be updated. And, in fact, is running some of the same software. I mean, how many websites are like that? The glass half empty, of course, is boy, does the site ever need a complete overhaul. And, but there were some things that were very successful in the design, I would say. We're one of the few sites that's existed since it was one of the first sites up in the United States, because we learned about the web from CERN, where it was developed via the Slack library system, which had the first site up. And none of the URLs have ever broken. We implemented a URL scheme such that everything's algorithmic based on the archive ID. And since the first website went up in 1993, everything's been completely stable, which will have some implications I'll mention. If you want overlays and things like that, it provides a stable substrate for all of that. Now, as was mentioned earlier, the original motivation for this was to level the playing field. It wasn't intended as, some game-changing act, but it was to solve a very simple problem. There were these pre-existing paper systems which struck me as incredibly unfair both within the United States and globally, as was mentioned. We're talking about Research One countries, but I really had, the developing world, and that this was in 1991, was shortly after the old Soviet Union came apart. And I kept hearing from researchers, who said, well, we can't afford journals, but we do have, our modem and our connection to the internet, and who were praising the access that the system gave to them. And so that was the original intent, that we had the paper distribution system. It was unfair. Things went more slowly to some parts of the world. If you were a graduate student, we've heard from some of the younger people lower down in the food chain, you would have to rely on, the faculty member who was on this privileged mailing list. And, that struck me as unfair, because if we have some inspiration, we like to think, if we have some research development, we like to think it was because we had more insight or we worked harder, but not because we had advanced access to privileged information. So the idea was, and this thing was, it didn't require a big meeting like this one to implement it originally, but it was nonetheless something that I'm even wearing here. You probably can't read, but for this reason, it's an Aspen Center for Physics insignia vest, where that summer I was with a bunch of physicists, and I spent a couple of days discussing the ins and outs and questions like, should, things be announced immediately? Should it be once a week or every day? And so, it was something of a community effort. And then, I went back and wrote it. So what's in this graph, it's the number of submissions per month going back to August of 1991. And just to remind you that 1991 is, now long before the current generation of undergraduates that I teach in my courses, and highlights in here. I'll just mention one, which is always my favorite. In early 1994, when I showed this, which already was a website to the American Physical Society that was busy putting its journals online, that it was online before any journals is also another important point that I'll come back to, and suggested this is a good mode. And I have, in response, an email that I'll always treasure from somebody on the Publications Oversight Committee at my professional society, which said basically that installing and learning to use a worldwide web browser is a very difficult enterprise, and it's much more than we can expect of the average physicist. So they went with some proprietary platform that nobody can remember anymore. And you can see here the growth that, it's this strangely, it looks like a linear pattern from 91 up to about 2007, 2008. And that's really the confluence of lots of different communities signing on. And then that growth rate has even been increasing in the last 7 or 8 years. And so this is just an overview of the statistics. I won't say a lot. Over a year ago, it passed through the 1 million documents. It's currently growing about 110,000 new submissions per year. So we're, estimating probably closer to 2 million by the end of 2020. And the activity levels, it's hundreds of millions of full text downloads per day, including, I'll anticipate, lots of, surprising amount of activity from the general public. And so it also plays an important role in science outreach. This is sorry, was that a question? Okay. This is just a breakdown in terms of subject area, which is informative. The two plots have the same information. The first is color coding according to what the subject areas are, and the second is just dividing by the vertical, so you get the fractional contributions from all these subject areas. So early on, of course, it's blue, and that's the original high energy physics, which you can see within a few short years, although everybody kept saying, well, this is just high energy physics, but within a few years it was, far from even the dominant component. As in that same 1994 timeframe, just to again anticipate the point that we're not talking about a monolithic community. We had the snipers from the astrophysics community in 1994, when this red was very small, get up publicly and say, well, this is all well and good for the high energy physicists who are only interested in developments of the last 10 nanoseconds, but it will never catch on in a serious subject area such as astrophysics. And of course, you can see within 5 to 10 years, there were more astrophysicists than high energy physics. And I mention that point because, it took a while to catch on for math. Eventually it caught on. That's this big sort of magenta region. And most recently, it's the CS, the orange here, which has been ramping up. In particular, the highly active deep learning community has latched onto it. And if I have time, I'll talk about some of the interplay with the popular media articles about that. It's one of the more popular public areas. And, the take home from this graph is just there's something of a ratchet effect. Once the community adopts it, for whatever reason, we've seen there's just no example of a community that then has backed off. It's always continuous growth. These growths, of course, are not increases in the number of articles being written. They're just, percentage participation of communities. And, in the high energy physics community, that was one where you can see clearly from the graph that it basically saturated within about 5 or 6 years. We had 100% participation from the community, and it was very healthy for that community. Here, I'd just like to point out, we do have this HHMI repository that we set up, and Ralph was mentioned, and I saw him in the audience there, has been with it. And, you know, I'll have to say we intentionally named it quantitative biology so that we didn't seem to be, you know, trying to preempt all of biology, because, you know, we understood there was, you know, a tightrope to be walked there. And, you know, it's been growing. There was the overall growth rate actually is quite strong in the last 5 years. Ewan Callaway, I remember, also wrote an article about that. Was actually what the article I referred to before was about. And, you know, there was a blip in 2013, which it actually exceeded the growth rate. But if you just look at the, you know, the slope from 2011 to 2015, that's what we expect to continue. So, you know, there's, even in this little experiment, there's a signal that there could be some movement. These are just some, again, I mentioned these are the standard slides. I'll, you know, about this, just say it was once cutting edge. This is now all commonplace. And there were various surprises for me along the way. Oops. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. I just looked at myself up on the screen and I was frozen and the audience was frozen. And so, but then I stopped and you started nervously fidgeting. So that was it. So that was good. Yeah, okay, I won't worry about my, okay, yeah, I felt my face, it's still warm. It's, the only thing I was going to say about this, by way of surprise, is that it's, when I grew up in the 1960s watching commercial television, the financial model was advertisers paying for eyeballs. That is, the advertisers had you sitting in front of a screen, and as long as you didn't run away, they were able to push the stuff up in front of you. And I've always find it sort of ironic that the financial model that funds so many of these essential resources that we use, you know, specifically the search engine and everything else, is this commercial network model from the from 1960s television. Okay, so the let's ask the first question here regarding preprints that Ron asked me to discuss, which is why? Why are so many people using it? Why did it catch on in these communities? I can't answer why it hasn't caught on in other communities, but that could be a function of time. And I start out on this slide with some tautological statement about how it's the primary mode of communication for many of these fields. And that's true, that researchers in these fields get up every day. It's not me making this up. And the first thing they do is check in their subfield, the new 10 or 15 papers that have appeared, like reading the newspaper every day. And it is just one of these network effects. Everybody uses it because everybody uses it. And for many of these people, many of the authors, it's crucial in many ways. It's crucial to permit them to put things out to the community for early dissemination of their results. It's crucial for getting lots of feedback. I'll come back to that point. And it's good for their medium-term visibility, and it's also good in the long term for archival findability. And to illustrate, you know, some of the things that have always perplexed me about, say, the NIH's move to make PubMed Central mandatory and university moves to make deposition of articles mandatory. When I give talks to, for example, the aforementioned undergraduates, I mention this event from 2005, in which Congress passed a law requiring users to post to YouTube, and that, of course, is catalyzed this explosive growth of YouTube, and it became the resource that we now know and love. If I'm lucky, maybe 1 out of 100 undergraduates will hesitantly raise a hand and ask me, did that really happen? And the answer is no, of course not. But what's my point? The point is, why do we share things via YouTube? Because it's a public good. Things become more valuable by sharing, and they don't degrade. The reuse of these digital objects is just enhanced by more people being able to use them. And, that's the basic underlying motivation. And there's even an analog notion of virality. And I'll, again, return to that. But, there's a chance that lots of people see it, millions of people will see it, and, millions of people watch the video. And there are articles which millions of people have looked at because they're out there. Okay, so the first issue was the network effects. They're also used in an important way to stake priority claims. So I'm going to say this in a few different ways because it's something that has repeatedly irked me. I keep hearing from biologists, and this just won't go away, that, oh no, what if you get scooped because you put it out there? And the point is, you can't get scooped if it's public. I mean, nobody in their right mind would take something that's public, it's date stamped, it's authenticated, and then claim it as their own. So why do people keep on thinking that that's an issue? I can't really answer that. I do want to go back to the history, which is interesting in this regard. Everybody mentions Henry Oldenburg correctly as having founded the Philosophical Transactions in 1665, but he based it on the system that was then being used to stake land claims. That was his original motivation, and it really was for people to, just as they staked property rights by having a journal in which all of these things were recorded, it was for the purpose of staking intellectual property rights. And now, of course, I will leave this to Ron to talk about, but one of their intriguing position articles is how journal publication dates can now even obscure these priority issues. From the standpoint of the physics community, I just want to make it clear, preprint and publication are simply equivalent from the standpoint of a priority claim. I'll even tell you an anecdote here, which will drive this point home more forcefully, which is, this predates preprints. When I was a graduate student, the standard reference for asymptotic freedom, the fact that quarks are weakly coupled as you get to higher and higher energies, probe at smaller and smaller distance, was always given as to Gross and Wilczek, and separately Politzer. They were at Princeton, he was at Harvard. And then in addition, unpublished remarks by Gerard et Tuft at 1972 Marseille conference. You can see this is still etched in my memory because over 20 years later, they couldn't award that Nobel Prize because there were 4 people, not 3. And eventually this was adjudicated by awarding et Tuft a Nobel Prize for something else. And then after waiting a discrete amount of time so it didn't seem unseemly, they awarded the other Nobel Prize to those 3. So it's a long, long pattern. And, you'll see on Archive an article that with the proof of the Poincare conjecture that never went to a journal, that did result in Perlman being awarded both the Fields Medal and then later on the $1 million Millennium Prize. So once again, nobody scooped him. He turned both of those down, but that's a different issue. So let's just agree it's non sequitur, you can't be scooped, and quoting Lynn Truss, anyone who keeps insisting on that being an issue should be struck by lightning, hacked up on the spot, and buried in an unmarked grave. Now, why are physicists, still using both systems? That's another thing that Ron told me might come as a surprise, and I can't really explain this one. This is one where, I discount myself as a prophet. And let me ask an organizer here, because I'm now at 8:10, so I don't know what time I started. How should I be budgeting my time? I'm anticipating another 5 minutes, roughly.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. Doesn't look like anybody's left yet. So we're still using both systems in parallel. And, back 20 years ago, I wrote this as a metastable equilibrium. That's physics shorthand for, something that is long-lived but not eternal. You're in some local minimum, but not the global minimum of your energy potential, but there's a barrier that you have to tunnel through. And I said the current system where physicists and increasingly mathematicians back then, and now many more fields, were using the preprint system to disseminate things, but nonetheless, we're still submitting in parallel to the journals. And the journals, in turn, were being funded by subscriptions paid by institutional libraries, which in turn were funded by overhead on grants, and that system couldn't possibly persist for another 5 years. And so obviously I was wrong, having written that 20 years ago. I still think I was right. I just got the time constant wrong. I don't think it can persist indefinitely. But the basic reason is why not? Why not just continue using both systems? And it's something of a free insurance policy. And if you ask physicists why they do this, most will say, and they're true to this, most will say, look, if I'm just doing it, writing a paper on my own, I just want to get something out there, I'll just post it and not deal with all the journal stuff. But if they're writing with a junior person, which most of us do, and you want to make sure to promote their career as an insurance policy and to give them, the leg up both in grant and job allocation, you put it out to the journal. And, incidentally, I have, I am not an enemy of peer review. I benefit from it. I think that, if we didn't have peer review, we'd have to implement some other form of quality control. There might be more efficient ways of doing it and, crowdsourcing and all of the rest, but I'm not in any way arguing that we should do without quality control. I did actually want to mention on the previous slide, getting back to, there was something I mentioned to Ron, so all of your younger people who watch the video on the ASAPbio site, don't go away with the impression that peer review was invented in 1665 by Henry Oldenburg, despite the fact that it basically says that and has it in writing. Peer review is basically a 20th century construct for the most part. Back then it was Henry Oldenburg himself who was serving as a scientific editor, and that's the way these professional society journals worked, I'm told, for hundreds of years, until the scientific fields got so large that no one editor could really have the knowledge of an entire field, and then started having to implement some form of mass production methodology. And really in this country, it was in the post-Sputnik funding era when so many fields started expanding horizontally that, and incidentally, the society journals were no longer large enough to be able to cover entire research fields, that the commercial publishers stepped in. And, that's correlated with needing these new forms of quality control. Anyway, so what do people do? I've put in the middle of this slide. Sometimes it's all possible modes. It's, not correct to say all the preprints are before publication. There are people who submit before they submit to a journal. There are some people who wait until they've heard from the journal. We'll see an example of that fairly soon. And then there are lots of people who do it simultaneously. They'll post to the journal at the same time they post to the archive. And Ron asked me, I looked up, we have this journal reference field and also a DOI field. So it was very easy to just look up 7 years worth of data up to 2014 to let it stabilize. And over 80% of the articles had some form of journal reference. And that's and this is just in a specific in high energy physics, where we probably have better citation data than in other fields. But that's an underestimate in two ways. One, we could be missing a lot. That's just counting the ones that definitely have some DOI or journal publication associated to themselves. More importantly, it doesn't include lots of things that have also been subjected to some form of review. Most of the remainder of that, 15 to 20% is conference proceedings, theses, and lecture notes. So the vast majority of it is, creditable information. There's not some violation of the second law of thermodynamics or anything going on here. People really are ingesting solid information and using it for the research. The question came up, is it safe? In the sense that if you post it, will you still be able to send to a journal? Here's one where the history does matter. In physics, we did have, as I mentioned, we were online before any of the journals were online. So it would have been impossible to, forbid authors to use the archive, because that would have risked alienating authors, and any journal that did that would have lost submissions. And so I think, to some extent that's still true. The journals are, require the support of the community, and, they have to accommodate community practices rather than dictate them. And, that's obviously not an ultimatum or something like that. We're all in this together. The preprint form, this was a question that was raised in Ron Talk, really is used in CV for jobs and grants as evidence of productivity. Chris Myers did a search of the NSF site for all of the archive IDs and found lots of uses both in the NSF press releases for the research and also in the research proposals. And, I use that all the time when we're evaluating a job applicant. If all you have to go on is the published papers, that, shows you what they did up to 2 years ago, but what have they done for us lately? If they don't have any recent preprints, it, really works against them. You want to have, and you want to see and look at them to see how active the person has been. There's the question of whether this leads to low quality. And so here there was this question of irreproducibility. And from what I read in these Science and Nature accounts, 80% or more of biomedical research is currently unreproducible. So could it possibly get worse? In general, I would say, from the people we know about, there hasn't been a decrease in quality. I'll get to the non-members of the community in a bit, but, think about it from the standpoint of the members of the community. They have to be even more careful. They're putting it out there. People sweat bullets before they press that submit button because, nobody wants to be embarrassed. And so there's a dramatic amount of quality control. Just a lot of people like me, before I'm willing to put up something online, I pass it through people that I know in advance and make sure I'm not saying something silly. So it's not like people are rushing out there to put up half-baked things. Oh, and this I added while, during the preamble, since so, yeah, we have to be careful, but I did want to mention that this becomes algorithmic. I was teaching a class that involved some machine learning, and I had this inspiration that I could, classify these articles. I won't go into, I can go into it in my group tomorrow because I'm already well over time. But, and I only have another slide or two, but there is a machine learning exercise that I'm very proud of, which just uses textual features to infer quality, and in particular, double checks by using, sort of 2 grams, 3 grams, 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence of word probability distributions. You have an extraordinary amount of success over, in the 90% or more level of these articles that are ultimately removed by moderators or flagged for the, we do have this general physics section, which is, something of a free-for-all for how to describe it. It's, the area for people who still have an institutional affiliation, but are in one way or another sort of off the rails. And it has, as you know, if you have such a thing, which is acting as an online filter, from medical diagnostics, if you've got a too high a false positive rate, if we were 100,000 submissions a year, if it was flagging 10% incorrectly, then we would have moderators unnecessarily wasting time on, an additional, looking at an additional 10,000 things. But it's less than a 0.2% false positive rate. In order to improve it, I looked at that, and, frankly, I disagree with the moderators were giving too much of the benefit of the doubt in some cases. Okay, where do they get submitted to? That's also interesting. The heaviest pressure is on general relativity and quantum cosmology and grand unified theories and all the rest. Let's see, I think I'll skip this. While I was at the Ithaca airport this morning, I had a very fascinating conversation with chemist Roald Hoffman, also who's supposed to be on the same flight as me, and I think I'll defer that. I would say something about how it increases the speed. So for this, I have a very recent event from mid-December. CERN, the LHC, had an announcement of a new boson seen in the diphoton channel. So the same thing that the original Higgs was seen 3 years ago, but possible new event. And this is data I provided to Nature, and they did this wonderful story about it, showing in those last 2 weeks of December, there were a couple hundred articles actually by, within the first month. And during this period, I remember the last 2 weeks, everybody was talking about all of the records that were being set by Star Wars: The Force Awakens, the box office records. But I was much more impressed by the articles that were submitted in mid-December. Within 2 to 3 weeks, were the fastest ever to receive over 100 citations. So this is an example of the community, and these are good articles. Once again, there are no compromises here. They're thoughtful. People are working very hard. I could show you some of them. They're building on one another, and they're citing one another. So it's just a much faster mode of operation. Let's see, maybe I'll hold off on this. I wanted to show a similar thing, but I'll defer that. There are already about 20 or 30 high-quality articles that have appeared based on this gravitational wave that was announced, the GW 150914, I guess. The 150914 is, of course, the date, September 14th, 2015. I don't know what the GW is. Oh, gee, I never would have guessed. I'm told the Broad has filed a patent claim on the waveform. And has some backdated notebooks to prove it, but it's not going to. Okay. And I did, I mentioned earlier about public engagement and, just again, very, very quickly, because I'm over the, we get lots of articles that generate this, once the typical community has 500 to 1,000 people, so that's all you're going to get with a seminal article in a week. And if you have an article that gets hundreds of thousands of people, and they're very, very fascinating dynamics, you can see the refers in the upper left here. There was an article in the Atlantic in which, where's the flux, what's this about? And in the interview, the person mentioned the magic word megastructure. So this was a star that would decrease in amplitude by 20% every once in a while. And so, what is megastructure? This is the abstract of the article. Megastructure is this Dyson sphere-like object. And as soon as, there's always a tie-in to a popular meme. And so they intimated this might be these giant artificial structures put around a star in order to harvest energy. That was, one of the few. So there were a few again, this is the rapidity of the research community, a few follow-ups within a few weeks, all very serious articles, people who then looked at the photographic plates at the Smithsonian at this object for the past year and said it was fading. And then somebody else came back and said, oh no, it's could be just an artifact of the calibration, but there's this high quality, conversation going on, and, things that might take a few years to play out are happily being decided on a much more rapid time frame. I put in another quote from a US president. I just wanted in my last two slides to vent my spleen of all of the misconceptions out there. I keep hearing, preprints worked. I thought this would have gone away 20 years ago, but, it only works for these physicists because they all work in experimental groups of thousands of people. No, that's not true. If I were there, I would ask you to look at me and tell me in seriousness that you think I have ever worked in a group of, thousands of people. You have colleagues go to the physics department and look at the condensed matter physicists who do these tabletop experiments, and that's the majority of physicists. That's what they do. Okay, and then, we keep hearing about how they're less competitive, and that's another one that, always amazes me. I don't know what you mean by competition, but you take any self-respecting physicist or mathematician or computer scientist, and they'll challenge you. It doesn't matter. They'll challenge you to an athletic competition. They'll challenge you to an intellectual competition. They're no less competitive. That's not the reason. Okay. It's also not a monolithic community. There's a mixture of completely different cultures. The low temperature experimentalists were actually very slow to pick it up, these different communities. And I remember in the late 1980s, there was the high temperature superconductors where, you would see these nth order photocopies of faxes being passed around as people were trying to establish their priority claims. And I always thought this was 2 years before the archive started. Too bad, we didn't get, some phenomenon like that. But then it happened. In the 1990s, there was this phenomenon of magnesium diboride, which brought in a whole bunch of experimentalists. And then 2007, an even bigger community working on iron pnictides. And so these new materials come in, they bring in the experimentalists, and they start adopting and they stay with it. So I think that's, I mentioned that because that's probably a closer analog to the way the biologists are working. But, they're completely different from the astrophysicists, who in turn are completely different from the mathematicians who are, proving interesting theorems and getting huge responses to the computer scientists. And, there was this enormous article, very well timed, late November, by an economist doing an analysis of the economy of the empire after the Death Star, and you can read it. Okay. Finally, single-stop shopping, is it useful to have everything aggregated in one place? I would say yes. There are a variety of data mining applications. For me, this is the most exciting part. It's not part of the purview of this talk at all, but there are enormously interesting things you can do with usage data, text mining, and all of the rest. In principle, you could have things in separate places. That was the idea of the Open Archive initiative for metadata, to create these overlays, and there would be a protocol for ingesting the data from these different sources and creating these agglomerations. But in practice, this is just people told me in 1991 that the way to do this is to have all the institutions hold on to these things separately, but it just turned out to be more robust, and users have, for the moment, found it easier to do their one-stop shopping and know that they have, if it's not on archive in their field, for those fields where we have 100% coverage, it may as well not exist. So that's the operational statement right now. It's, not necessarily the way things have to be moving forward. And my last slide, I think, So last slide, Ron asked me to touch on our technical issues, specifically, where I think things stand for financial support and all of the rest. And there are definitely some challenges right now. Ralph, who's there, is just stepped down as the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board. He's still alive. He'll and will be able to relay some of the discussions we had during his tenure on that. The library does a very good job, and I'm very happy that it's embedded in the library because it's given it this long-term stability. In some ways, people don't have to worry about what will happen if I fall off a mountain. On the other hand, the library will be in existence 100 years from now, and the thing has been incredibly stable. If you look at it, it is just up all the time. There are simply no outages. On the other hand, the library, has had questions about, especially during the financial crisis, so the 2008-2009 timeframe, was given marching orders by the provost community that, you have to cut your budget. And they looked at something like this and said, well, most of the benefit is accrued to the exterior. So, in our primary mission is to serve within the university, so we have to come up with a different model. The model they came up with works better than I would have expected. It's a membership model along the lines of National Public Radio and other resources where you get libraries to make these small contributions. For most of them, it's it's a few $1,000s, which librarians tell me is no big deal because that's, comparable to what they have to pay as page charges for a single open access article. And here they're, basically paying as a goodwill donation for arbitrary number of articles for all of their users. And so, and we're also getting absolutely essential funding from the Simons Foundation. Happily, the purview mathematics, physics, and computer science meshes with what they cover. I would say the one thing we're missing in the library environment is, there's cutting edge development, which is just not happening. They don't hire they don't hire PhD researchers. With library salaries, they don't necessarily get the best programmers. And there really is, I joked about this in my first slide, but the entire code base really does need to be rewritten. Perl was the langage du jour of 2 decades ago, but now it's increasingly difficult to find a programmer who can maintain it. And then, what's the long-term goal if you did have ample funding and all of that? And, I'll just, since I'm really out of time, I'll cut this to one sentence and say, I think about it as some Amazon-like warehouse where, we have some comprehensive repository of all science and also these incredible tools for navigating it and, for information navigation and discovery. But again, that would be a much longer talk, and I will stop here and apologize for having gone so far over.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So Ron suggested, since I'm the remaining archive person here at the meeting, that I run this question-answer session. I think you got a good taste for what we are missing by not having Paul here. I am trying to answer any questions that you might have, over breakfast, reception, lunch, and so on and so forth during the meeting. As Paul said, I have been for the last 3 years the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board. I still am and have been for a long time the chair of the quantitative biology subject committee that is the most relevant for this meeting. And I'm a card-carrying physicist, but I also have papers in the Journal of Clinical Oncology and Nucleic Acids Research, so I do speak your language as well. But so this is not about me, this is about questions for Paul. Yes.
Well, I think you have to.
I'm going to try to.
Yes.
Is Paul still there? No, he's offline.
Paul, do we still have you?
Oh, no, I'm here.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Hi, Paul. Cynthia Wahlberger here. Sorry you're not here.
Oh, Cynthia, I'm so sorry.
I am too.
Okay.
So my question was about, so I realize that there are a lot of other tools that are just not feasible to implement right now, but what about commenting? So there's been a lot of talk ahead of this meeting about post-publication review. And has the physics community considered adding some form of commenting to the archive, and or would that not be a useful function for the community?
Well, it would certainly be a useful function. This again is a question that's come up every year. We actually had a meeting about it in 1994, and the difficulty with it is. People were very concerned, and I think legitimately so. I mean, we floated it, and the response was many people thought it was much better to be a pure dissemination site and to keep, commentary and other add-ons at both a logical remove and, certainly a logical remove and presumably a physical remove as well. That, people just wanted everything to be up there in cold ASCII and people to make their own decisions. Now, with that said, of course, we all benefit enormously from commentary. And the difficulty with implementing it at the archive site is because it's so big, is that it would likely involve some additional labor, additional human effort. And the staff that we have working on this is incredibly skeletal. I mean, they're stretched thin. The only reason the entire enterprise works is it was originally conceived to be entirely automated. It was, the original design was for 100 things a year. So at 100,000, we're now at 1,000 times the original design capacity. And, we're always right at the edge of being able to automate things and keep running it with the same size staff. And so the concern about comment threads is that you would need somebody to go in there and start looking at trolls, and that would be, for screening things. And there was a concern about visibility bias, that if some prominent person, posted on an article from some newcomer that this is silly, don't read it, and that could have career implications. And the reason we don't worry about things like that ordinarily is because everybody's reading things from different sources. But, since we're in this privileged position of everybody's looking at it, we have to be much more careful with what kind of graffiti would appear on articles. And so, then you're talking about human labor for doing editing, and then you start finding out why journals are so much more expensive than, archive, hundreds to thousands of times more expensive per article, because once you run into human editorial staff, that's where the real expenses start. So the correct way to do this scalably is by offloading it. And that's effectively what we do, via blog sites, that we do have this ability to both harvest and post trackback. So on an article, it can say, oh, there's a blog discussion. And then, we effectively have the blogger acting as the editor and screening the trolls and making sure that the conversation is high quality. And so, that's the way I think that it would have to work in the future, that we would have to rely on, and we're not, we don't have the labor to organize the community of volunteers. So the short answer to your question is yes, it would be extremely useful, but it would be much more difficult to maintain in the long run and than, the current pure dissemination system. And, therefore, I think we made the right choice to focus on what we were good at.
Okay, Paul, we have a lot of people asking questions, so maybe a little shorter answers.
I had a question.
We may need to be a bit shorter, Paul. But so next is Randy Sheckman.
Hi. So this follows on the last question. So you rely then, it sounds to me, you rely on journals, really, for peer review. Or are there different styles? You refer to blogs that are taken offline where papers are discussed offline. Is that a style that many of your investigators use in putting revised manuscripts back up? Or do they all really rely on the peer review processes at journals?
Trying to think of how to answer that in one sentence. Yes and no. The feedback comes from both directions. People post it, and there's a question as to whether and we do have, it's quite important, we do have the complete version control. So, we can adjudicate lots of these questions of who had what idea when. Some of the feedback they get comes from interested parties who want to be cited. Some of the feedback, is substantive. Some of it comes from the referees, and I would say it all comes in parallel. I would say definitely the final quality does, benefit from the peer review process as well, though.
Okay.
Hi, David Drubin from UC Berkeley. You convincingly made the case, Paul, that physicists are at least as competitive as biologists, maybe even more competitive. But one thing
and genetically superior.
Okay. But one thing that you said was a little bit alarming, that the use of the preprint server to establish priority. I wonder, could that motivate people to, say, throw something up there that's kind of half-baked to stake a claim? And maybe people would become more aggressive as a result of that.
Yes, I tried to speak to that, and physicists as well were worried about that, and that was part of what I was trying to address by when I said that people really are worried about embarrassing themselves. There are two effects there. One is, you don't want to put up something that's completely wrong. The second is, and this is something we see in the usage data, which we call the boy who cried wolf effect, that you actually see people who make, these claims, which are then not supported by the article behind it. And if they do it 2 to 3 times, their subsequent articles get essentially no readership. So the community is tracking these things, and people are very careful not to make, half-baked claims for that reason. There is a, sort of a natural regulatory mechanism for that.
Okay, wait, yeah, yes. No, he has a microphone. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Sam Diaz-Munoz, NYU, and I just wanted to make a comment about the fear of being scooped. I agree that it doesn't seem rational, but our research enterprise sometimes doesn't advance rationally, and I just wanted to highlight a blog post that I linked in my commentary if you want to look it up, about a scientist who submitted a paper to a PLOS journal of all places and basically got rejected because after he posted his preprint, another person raced to peer review and got it. And when he tried to establish priority of discovery with the preprint, it was appealed, but then it was overturned. And eventually it's a happy story because PLOS eventually came back and said that it was fine and went ahead with publishing the article. But it's an anecdote, but it drives perception, and perception really becomes reality when it comes to getting buy-in from junior scientists into the system.
Well, my takeaway from that is the happy ending. By the way, on the chat button here, it just came, somebody just sent me a chat message telling me to turn off my video and turn it back on again.
We can see
and that's it, done the trick.
Okay, go over there.
Hi, I'm Ruth Lehman from NYU. I wanted to know more about the quality control. So you said that when there is again and again somebody publishes something that is not correct, then people just don't read it. But I don't know, in biology at least, there's the danger this is important for health, right? And so a lot of people will be interested and could be misled. And do you remove those people who continuously, because you said something that there were algorithms where you could take the papers offline. What is your mechanism of, continuous defaulters or really clearly wrong messages, wrong papers which never see the published domain?
Well, the first statement is nothing that goes up is ever taken down unless there's a legal copyright claim. So, once something slips through and the daily things that go out, it's an archive, and we're never in the business of erasing history. And as mentioned, all subsequent versions are also kept up, and previous ones are made available. But there is a mechanism that permits things to be blocked, and Ralph can say more about that. Before they go out, and it's it's sometimes contentious, but there are volunteer moderators, and these things are parceled up. There are 142 different subject areas right now, so and some of them have 2 moderators, and so there are people who see the abstract of every article by email as soon as it's submitted. And frequently, they'll look only at the abstract. Frequently, they'll have to pour into the article. But, they're sort of the safekeepers for these communities. And the Cornell Library, since the modus operandus of the archive is, consistent with Cornell academic principles, relies on this group of volunteers to sort of find these things. Some moderators have a reputation as, being a little too harsh. Some have a reputation of being a little too loose. But in general, they're obviously just looking at the abstract. We call it the one look approximation, is not, intended in any way, shape, or form. It's just to establish, is this science or is it non-science, and also is it appropriate to the subject area. But they're also the ones who know the community well enough so that if somebody is abusing it, and they do it multiple times, they'll just start saying, look, this is absolutely unpublishable, and it is not, the criterion we use is it's not plausibly interesting to the community, and so they'll just start refusing it. And so there is a mechanism for doing that. The algorithmic measures I mentioned is, something that I noticed, which is as the system got larger and larger, obviously human moderators, they go on vacation, they get distracted, they get busy occasionally. And, based on what the moderators were doing, that was the machine learning exercise, and which, as I mentioned, was extraordinarily successful as a backup for the human moderators and as an amplification of their abilities. It does additional flagging to focus things that it thinks they really need to see, and also does things like detects automatically generated articles like from SciGen, the sort of probabilistic context-free grammar stuff, and does a variety of other automated checks and just puts things on hold to make sure a person looks at it. So there are a variety of both automated and manual checks on these things, but again at a level 1,000 times less stringent than in a conventional peer review.
Paul, it's Mark Hirscher from Harvard Medical School, and I guess I'd just like your comment on, you've given us a very positive view of this thing that you created and how it's grown and developed. And I wonder what some of the issues you think are not so satisfactory, if there are any. And also, in projecting this, since you know something about biology and what goes on in biology, are there things that would not be so well adapted to the biological community that you think we should be concerned with?
No. It's a long question. One of my great regrets is it not being able to be there tonight and tomorrow. Is this is the only way I actually learn about the biology community, and Ron has assembled this fantastic group, and I was hoping just to osmose what's going on, and so I don't know what the red flags are in there. I don't see, the only, the things I see on the horizon, I think are interesting algorithmic challenges. There's something I never would have anticipated, for example, and something that gives me pause in computer science. There's this extraordinary set of scam journals. John Bohannon in Science wrote an article about that, these so-called predatory open access journals, which have no peer review, but are making money off of apparently, well, sometimes not so innocent victims who are able to use publications in these journals to further their careers in places like India. And, it just confuses this whole, you'd like to think there was this separation between refereeability and publishability, which is our nominal criterion, which is why we've switched it to plausibly of plausible interest. And, a lot of those I can detect algorithmically and say they're not plausibly interesting. So, a challenge, it would be an interesting challenge would be to take, to see if one could do that with biology articles. And, I believe it would be possible. This is in this wonderful big data realm that we teach about. But this is a very naive answer. And I wish, you could have asked me the same question tomorrow night after I'd heard from all of you about these things.
Okay, I think we can take those three and then probably stop. Let's start here and there. And then. Okay.
Paul, it's Mike Eisen. So you must now have a fair amount of data on what happens between the initial posting of an article in arXiv and its publication after whatever review it goes through to get published in a journal. Have you looked either using some automated method or using some kind of curated method to get an estimate or some kind of assessment for how much articles change after peer review, and do you have any? And is there any sense about the level of improvement, not just the level of change?
In the short answer is I haven't done anything systematic because it's not and to qualify that even further. There's more, as I mentioned, there's more that goes on between the first version and the last version than just peer review. There are all forms of review and all forms of feedback. And actually, a lot of times the final arXiv version comes after the published version. They found additional things after it was published. And so those are certainly coming after the peer review. One, semi-farcical study that I did recently was, based on an email where somebody, just emailed me irked that every time he submits an article, he gets all of these people who say, oh, you forgot to cite my very interesting work, and was convinced that some of these are robotically generated. And, it just got me at the right time. And, this is easy to do. It's all public data, but it just happens I can open a IPython notebook on my research machine, and in 30 minutes, look through all authors that appear in V2s of articles compared to V1s of articles, and you can find systematically every author who's doing it, and also find, yes, it works. There are people who, during a 10-year period, on that basis, got hundreds of citations that they might not otherwise have gotten. The other question you asked is, how much is the improvement? That's an interesting challenge, and it's something that would be an interesting research project for a CS student here. But I haven't done it. It's possible, though.
Hi, this is Mike Lauer from the National Institutes of Health. Thank you very much. It was a really interesting talk. I'm wondering if you could briefly talk with us a little bit about how your community's funding agencies, so NSF, NASA, Department of Energy, and maybe the military, how have they interacted with you, with arXiv? How do they treat arXiv preprints? How does your community feel about arXiv and their interactions with their funding agencies?
Yeah, again, I tried to slip in some comments about that. It goes two ways. The first is NSF has, from the research side, has provided funding for arXiv, starting in 1994. And it started when I was at Los Alamos, which is a DOE research lab, and I also was on good terms and with the DOE as a funding agency. And if you search, I didn't do it, Chris Myers did this exercise for Ron of looking at the NSF website at all of the grant proposals, and found lots and lots of arXiv IDs mentioned there, both as part of the proposals and also as part of the final reports. That in many cases for the final reports, people were reporting as a sign of their productivity something that hadn't yet been published, and therefore was only able to use the arXiv ID. And so the DOE, the NSF, are very much accommodated to it because that's the way the community works. And their reviewers are members of the community. And so, again, they're aware of how to use these things. Just as I mentioned, we use them for job applicants as signs of recent productivity as opposed to productivity from a few years before. The NASA, again, is entirely on board. Some of the results I was going to show, I can flip through there of, searching for this GW 150914. That's all NASA-funded stuff. NASA also funds the astrophysical data system, the astrophysics data system at the Harvard-Smithsonian, and we work very hard to stay interoperable with them, and they cite all of the arXiv preprints, and after some, initial hesitation 20 years ago, the astrophysicists have signed on in a big way. And it's not just the physics part of NSF, the math part of NSF and the computer science components of NSF also appear to be, thoroughly conversant in and understanding of. And where I say understanding, it means, with all the caveats. This is unpublished and it's not peer reviewed. And so, there's still this period of symbiosis where people understand that things eventually will be published, and if that goes away, then there are some open questions.
Okay, we take one last question.
So that sort of gets to the point that I was going to make. This is Jennifer Lippincott-Schwartz from NIH. So there's a lot of, we live in a very politically polarized world, and there are, I'm just curious as to whether you've faced situations where things have been put on the archive related to, such hot button issues like global warming or autism, related, the whole issue related to autism, whether you've found that this is a potential problem where, if somebody does post something on that archive, it then can be used in a political way that essentially motivates a particular point of view. The issues that could sort of emerge where you have things that are not peer-reviewed that are put up there and then used by political organizations to support their particular cause. And in fact, that could be a motivation by a political group to actually promote research that they could then plop on to a system like this. So I'm just curious as to what are your thinkings along those lines as to how you can protect the public, really, our enterprise as scientists against that type of phenomenon emerging with this type of system?
All of these things are a concern at the risk of making this a slightly longer answer, but, including some of the things I didn't have time for in my original talk. Questions very much along these lines came up in the early days of the PubMed Central Advisory Board. Specifically, there was in Harold's original proposal, eBiomed, a proposal for a sector of preprints. And the history of this is that in our early meetings at NCBI, they had from Nick Cosarelli, who was then the editor-in-chief of PNAS, a pledge to join PubMed Central, but he refused to deposit PNAS holdings if it were to be alongside an unrefereed sector. And, we discussed various proposals of the way around it. And part of it was actually the issue that you mentioned, that in this case, since it was being hosted by NCBI, which sat in the National Library of Medicine, which sat in the National Institute of Health, it appeared that anything that was there, and if it had a Laetrile as a cure for cancer or something like that, then, there really was some kind of public health risk associated to it. And, semi-facetiously, we thought about mechanisms where if you went from PubMed and ended up in this refereed sector, you'd have to pass through this page that had, a big lightning bolt or something, or, danger signs or Jolly Rogers, whatever, to warn people you're now out of the peer-reviewed reason. But, ultimately, for reasons along the lines that you're concerned, as a site hosted by the National Institute of Health, it was slightly more problematic. Now, with that said, you mentioned specifically global warming, and we have had articles by global warming deniers, but, again, we're not doing peer review. If it's clearly not scientific, it's not using scientific methods and all of the rest, then the moderators are empowered to block it. We have had articles by James Hansen, who's still active at Columbia after he left NASA, and doing good research on the, I guess what we would call the pro side. But yeah, there are these politically charged issues. By and large, we haven't been buffeted by them. It will become a question in the future. We did have. We were sued by a creationist who had his 10-part creationist account of the universe, which was blocked as non-science. And there's also a good point here that when the lawsuit came up, it was bounced because it was filed in the wrong jurisdiction. It's actually filed in Tennessee, not far from the site of the Scopes trial. But had it been, it would have concluded that the Cornell Library has, as a part of a private university, unlike the government, has the discretion to include or not include anything into its collection. And so, the ability to do it is there, but the question becomes how much pressure are we putting on these volunteer moderators to make these kinds of judgment calls? And they have to do it on a one-day basis. And so, how worried are we that things slip through? And there is, there's going to be stuff that slips through, but, that's where we're helped by the, by not making any public claim that there's any that there's any rigorous quality control in this, but we do try to screen major embarrassments in the form of, things that would not be plausibly of interest to the research community. So, under the rubric of we're looking for things of interest to the research community, and if somebody says, global warming clearly isn't true, clearly isn't happening, and they have some graphs which just don't make any sense whatsoever, then, the moderators wouldn't be empowered to reject it. You mentioned the question of autism, and, I don't know what the I guess the researcher controversy you would mean is there a link to vaccines or something like that, which again would be, but then we, I'm sorry, but that actually appeared, that was Wakefield, that appeared in a journal. So, again, I would argue that, we're not going to be worse off than a journal in some of these regards, but absolutely it's a question, and, I wouldn't put out, given what I've seen, I know with certainty, that's why I've worked so hard on a lot of these algorithmic aspects, I certainly wouldn't put out a raw feed. And, if there are public health concerns in the case of biology that make it even more delicate, then, yeah, I think it would require more scrutiny. But I would also conclude by saying, though, that this is a solvable question, and it's anything but a showstopper.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for everything.
Wait, I've got two more people there.
Well, I think the decision.
He was raising his hands to clap. I don't want to stop that.
Should we take two more? I mean, I think Ron sort of indicated we should be stopping.
Okay, I'll tell you what, we'll take. We have about 10 more minutes left of comments from the audience here, and then.
Okay.
We can close. If we can take one more, Marty, if the question and the answer is short.
The question is short. You said that there are about 100,000 submissions now, I think a year.
A year, yeah.
And so how would this translate in terms of biological submissions? Is it much, much more, about the same? Do we have any estimate of that number?
It's more.
I would imagine it's more.
1,000 a year.
In all these cases, it depends how you define the size of the field. I think PubMed, when I asked David Lippman about 10 years ago, was indexing up to 400 or 500,000 articles, but that was a very broad swath that was including lots of chemistry and other associated areas. I mean, roughly speaking, depending how you define it, physics is 50 to 100,000, math 50 to 100,000, computer science 50 to 100,000. So, I guess by some definition of biology would also be in that 50 to 100,000 realm.
Okay. Was that another question on there?
Okay. Yes, I think we're going to move to.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and we are looking forward to your comments by all.
Yeah, I have to say, my students in class start putting on their coats 5 minutes before it ends. I'm really getting spoiled here.
Okay. And I'll see you next time in Cornell if my flight makes it there.
So, Paul, I think you're going to be at least joining us a little bit for audio, right? So if I think there are some questions that come up tomorrow, we could contact you.
Yeah, as I said, I've got absolutely nothing on my schedule here tomorrow.
So Paul is going to be a participant for the day. So there will be other times of which something relevant comes up that we want to query you. We'll give you a ping over there. Okay?
Yeah, you'll never know.
So it's not the last chance, not your last chance to talk to Paul. But
you won't know
it is getting close to your last chance to have a beer. So I think we better move on that direction. There are a few people. 3, to be precise, who wanted to give 2-minute or less comments. So, yeah, we'll do that, and then we'll adjourn for the evening and continue some of these discussions at the Pilot Lounge, which is the HHMI pub. But
all right, perhaps we can start with Sam Diaz-Munoz.
Okay, I stand between you and beer, so I'll keep it brief. So most in this room see junior scientists as beneficiaries and key players in the adoption of preprints. And beyond this room and its online audience, awareness of preprints is pretty low. And most junior scientists have a low risk tolerance for real and perceived costs of posting preprints. So it's important to raise awareness on 2 fronts. For people establishing policies and proposals, which are mostly senior scientists, it is important to them to understand and address the concerns of junior scientists. And junior scientists need to first know what preprints are, and second, voice their concerns and have them addressed. Now, we have already started action on this. How else? With a preprint. It's actually not a preprint. I would call it a pre-preprint. It's a working draft. It's in the commentary section of ASAPbio. And there's an open document that has questions and answers. It's supposed to be a practical guide for junior scientists. So I hope all of you go in there and I think and provide some input. And the goal for this document here at the meeting is to make sure the perspectives of junior scientists and researchers are considered in establishing proposals and policies. And beyond the meeting, something tangible resource for all stakeholders going forward. And I think getting this key constituency on board will boost the adoption of preprints and accelerate science and discovery, which is what we want.
Thank you. And moving to Annette Thomas, please.
Oh, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. What a great discussion. A couple of things. First of all, I'm pleased to be here. It's actually the first meeting that I'm actually here representing Springer Nature, which for those of you who missed it was the big merger that happened in scientific publishing last year between Macmillan, the parent company of Nature, and Springer. And why is that interesting? Publishing is a really complex ecosystem, and I know other people will be talking about that in the next day. But Springer Nature is now the second largest publisher after Elsevier. And when I look at what we're responsible for, what I'm responsible for, we're the largest open access publisher now, partly because Springer acquired VTech's Biomed Central several years ago, so many thanks to VTech for that. But there's a lot of open access publishing going on now. There's a lot of publishing like the Nature model where you have in-house editors. And there's a lot of academic publishing where editors are out of house and scientists are reviewing papers. And it seems the common point, the crunch point really comes at peer review and how do you facilitate that and make that happen in a good way that really adds value to everyone concerned. And I think a lot of what we're talking about here with preprints ultimately will come down to a question of how peer review is done, whether it's done after a preprint or part of a more formal process that we're familiar with now. But the reason that I wanted to talk, and that was just a bit of background, was because several years ago in 2007, when I was managing director of Nature Publishing Group, I was very keen on preprint servers, not to say that I'm not now, but I certainly was then. And actually, I think hatched over a beer with David Littman, he convinced me that I should launch a preprint server from Nature, which we did, called Nature Proceedings, and I gave it all my love and all my attention for 5 years. And ultimately, it didn't get enough traction. I think we published about 3,000 papers, ultimately about 60 a month towards the end. And it's still available in its archive, but it's not accepting submissions. So one thing I'm looking for here, and if you can grab me over a drink or a break, is why do you think it didn't work? Certainly, possibly it was a bit early, but execution-wise, what did we do wrong? Because I'm very keen to get anyone's feedback who is familiar with that. So as I said, about 3,000 papers. There was a bit of a spike in bioinformatics, but actually the papers were pretty evenly spaced: ecology, evolution, molecular biology, cell biology. And that's what I'd really like to get some feedback on. So thanks very much.
Thank you. And finally, Leslie Vossall.
So I've been stuck at LaGuardia for the last 8 hours. I'm really annoyed, but I'm really, really glad to be here. I'm sorry to miss Paul Ginsberg because my goal was to have him tattoo my arm with his signature because he's a big hero. So I used to think that Michael Eisen was just a big crackpot and that Harold Varmus was a big crackpot and that it was a total waste of time and that we were going to live with the current system. And then I started having my eyes open and I started signing every single open access, like, let's do this. I'm a signatory of hundreds of acts that we would actually do something, but we're not actually doing anything. And I hope that at the end of tomorrow, we will get some group of people together who will agree to publish their work rapidly. That's all I ask. I work on mosquitoes. Zika is spreading like wildfire through South America. There are papers stuck at journals that report discoveries that will impact the spread of the disease. And so I think preprints play a really important role in getting information out quickly. That said, my partner here, I love publishing with Emily. Like, it's great having professional editors to improve my work. And so I have no problem with the journals continuing to improve our work, but we must get our data out to the public, to the funders, and to our colleagues. It's just ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And one brief note for anyone who may have come in after the introductory talks. We do have yet more declarations for you to sign, but not just declarations, hopefully commitments to actual change on the website on asapbio.org/drafts. If you would be so kind as to review them and submit your comments by 1:15 p.m. tomorrow. Oh, yes, and also there is a statement on Zika virus under news, which was the product of journals. Oh, yeah. And we would like to briefly meet with the moderators and people who are responsible for recording the sessions before moving to the pub. So if you are moderating or recording tomorrow, please meet with us.
Also, sorry, Bernd, did you want to say something too? Well, it's okay. It's never going to happen because we're going to be rolling through very, very fast tomorrow. So that's his last 120-second comment.
Good, yeah. 3,000 is not a failure in that anyway, so I wouldn't class it as a failure. So just maybe two very quick points. I think I would like to discuss more the possible symbiosis between journals and preprint servers. I think there's a good chance that the avoidance of delays in sharing information on Zika, etc., will actually depressurize publishing and allow people to spend more time on an improved peer review process and improving a validation of information at the editorial level also. So if we depressurize publishing by pre-posting preprints, I think we all benefit on both sides. Second point I want to make, I think it would be really useful to come out of this meeting defining more clearly what we actually want to post as preprints. I don't think we necessarily just want to restrict it to pre-publication ready to publish manuscripts, but to possibly also publish smaller units of information, self-contained experiments that have enough experimental information and protocol around it to be standalone and reproducible, but to then aggregate as multiple preprints into into individual papers, so that we can accelerate information sharing even further. And I think it's also important to discuss what sort of information we should restrict preprints to, if we should restrict it to primary research information, or if we should allow commentary, speculation, hypothesis type of information. I think it would be useful to get a clear definition of what we come out with in biology.
And what is a preprint server? We need standard.
Okay, well, I think it was a great opening evening. I would say that, first of all, tomorrow we're going to move on to a very different flavor of the event where you're not just going to be listening to talks, but it's going to be, interaction and discussion and a chance for everyone here to have a voice. So I think that really is the most important part of the meeting happening tomorrow. But honestly, I would also very much encourage, the private conversations that are going to go on, for example, an opportunity right now until 11 o'clock at the pilot. Some people here are from HHMI, so, you can escort people to the pub. But in reality, that is, it's really through these social discussions that we'll also make progress. So I think that's important. And the last thing is, I know it may be asking for a lot, but we have a lot of work to do in a relatively short amount of time. So it may be a little harsh, but I would really like everyone in the room here tomorrow at 8 o'clock. And lastly, the moderators and the recorders, if you could, for tomorrow's breakout sessions, as Daniel said, just stay here for 5 minutes. Won't be more than that. Okay, thank you very much.